Leiden Walker, and I am the co-founder and CEO of NAMEPA, the North American Marine Environment Protection Association. And Rachel's going to put up our slide, which talks a little bit about who we are and what our mission is. We advocate to, as it comes up, our mission is to preserve the marine environment by promoting sustainable maritime industry practices and educating the public to save our seas. And there are a number of other things we do on top of that. One is communicating the value proposition of the shipping industry to the public, because as many of us bemoan, we seem to be an invisible industry, yet we are the engine of global trade. And we don't get the recognition for the value that we provide to global society. So I am, that's one of our primary goals, is to do one of the services that NAMEPA provides, because we try to find the balance between commerce and conservation. And we recognize that the whole environmental regulatory framework is a challenging one to understand and to really embrace. Even though it is required, it still is a challenge. So this year is the 50th anniversary of MARPOL, the marine pollution annexes that were developed by IMO. And so we're celebrating 50 years of protecting the marine environment. I'll be going to London for the September 28th is World Maritime Day, and we'll be actually celebrating MARPOL at IMO. But we felt it was important for us to honor the 50th anniversary by creating this MARPOL webinar series. And today joining us, we have Matt Davidson from ABS, Marcy Merksamer from BEMA, Jeanne Grasso from Blank Rome, and David Swindells from Ecochlor. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of them in just a minute. So I just also want to let you know that our annual series hasn't yet finished. We've got a collision between ships and whales in September, ship salvage and recycling in November, and shipboard operations and regulations in December. So I want to turn now to our panelists, and I'll back that up a little bit so you can, there we go. Matt is currently with ABS. He's the sustainability engineer, but formerly with NETSCO, where as a naval architect and marine engineer, he worked extensively with ballast water equipment technologies. And prior to that, he was with OSG. So he's, I don't want to say he's been around the block, but he certainly has earned his stripes in terms of the technology and its application, and today as it relates to sustainability. So Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Marcy Merksamer is the Secretary General of BEMA, which is the Ballast Water Equipment Manufacturers Association, but she's also a biologist and Vice President of Environment Management Company, and she's been there for many years. We won't go into that, but Marcy, you've helped propel BEMA into its current position as an observer status at IMO, and really have aided the industry in understanding the complexities of ballast management.
No, thank you for the introduction, Carlene.
Certainly. The next person I'm just going to introduce, because this is going to be a panel discussion format, so there's no right, wrong, or in any way prioritized, but Jeanne Grasso. Jeanne Grasso is a partner at Blank Rome Maritime, where she performs many functions. She is an expert in regulatory compliance, counseling with Coast Guard, EPA, US CBP, Maritime Administration. She also counsels on risk mitigation strategies related to pollution incidents around the world, and works on maritime environmental compliance and training in connection with federal and state requirements and pollution incident response. So Jeanne, I'm going to be very careful how I say this, but you're a renowned figure in supporting the marine environment and regulatory compliance. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Carlene. Happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And David Swindells is Director of Sales and Marketing for Ecochlor, which is a ballast water solution provider. And he's been there nearly 3 years, but prior to that, he was with Veritech of Canada. Now, one of the things that I find also compelling for today's conversation, he's a member of the planning committee for BEMA. So he works closely with Marcin and works closely with guiding all of us as we try to navigate the ballast water systems and ballast water regulations. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. I know you're taking a chunk of time out of your
Thanks,
day and
Kelly.
your busy schedules. First off, why don't we lay the framework for how does proper ballast water management contribute to safeguarding marine ecosystems and biodiversity? I mean, one of the things that, why did ballast water management come into play? Zebra mussels, invasive species, the lot. But how do we mitigate it, and what does proper management look like? Jeanne, you advise on this. What would you say proper management looks like?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Carlene. I mean, I think you need to look back at history to when these issues started and the attempts at regulation. At least speaking from the U.S. standpoint, the Coast Guard started with a voluntary program, which was in place for a number of years. That was not as successful as they wanted to. It morphed into a mandatory program of ballast water exchange, which then changed into ballast water treatment. So I think the spectrum over the years has really evolved, and I think everyone sees a need for it. It's just what was the most appropriate method: exchange, then treatment. And that transition really forced a technology, because when the treatment requirements came into play, the technology really didn't exist in any approved way. So that's kind of a very quick background, I think, of the importance of it.
Well, in terms of developing those regulations, and the ballast water first came up in the United States in 1988, but it wasn't until 2004 that the IMO tackled it, when MEPC approved a program for guidelines. And then the United States created its own format for those guidelines, its own requirements. But even the IMO's wasn't, it didn't even come into effect until 2017. How do we navigate through these ebbs and flows of regulatory changes and implementation? Marcy, what is your perspective on this? You've been navigating throughout.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's my view that ballast water is going to be a little bit different, from biofouling, in that, we can see that owners will experience a timely return on investment for reducing biofouling, and it's also going to help them meet their energy efficiency goals. Whereas, we have ballast water is really just about simply contributing to environmental sustainability of shipping. Like your first question, looking at safeguarding marine ecosystems and biodiversity. When a ship owner invests in a ballast water treatment, there isn't a large return on investment, other than maybe their public image and their ability to be a sustainable company. So I think as we enter into this phase of bringing in new regulations for biofouling, we may see things go a little bit quicker. And that's just my opinion, because there are going to be, clearly there will be some implications to vessel operations, but I don't think that it will be as substantive as adding ballast water treatment and the impacts to vessel operations there. So I think that we will see the trade-offs will be more acceptable when it comes to the biofouling regulations and the fuel efficiency benefits that can be gained. So again, we did see a really long lag time in ballast water, but I think there were a variety of things that influenced that. And hopefully some of the lessons learned in ballast water will help facilitate entering into the biofouling discussion, and also the other positive benefits that owners will receive from biofouling. So.
Oh, thank you, Marcy. I guess one question that is confusing to me are the different regimes. There's an IMO regime, there's a US government regime, and then you have VGP and VITA. Jeannie, how do we either compartmentalize, integrate, harmonize? How do we look at these different regimes and advise ship owners who are trading internationally or even just trading domestically?
Yeah, I think the U.S. unilateralism is one of the biggest challenges to the international shipping industry. We've got the Coast Guard that came out with its regulations around the same time. EPA came out with the vessel general permit, and we're looking back in the 2009, 10, 11 timeframe. IMO was working on ballast water management, and the U.S. opted not to sign on to the convention. So if you're trading internationally, you've got the IMO regime that you meet all over the world. You've got the Coast Guard regime and the EPA regime that you have to meet in the U.S., and they are similar but not identical. And you've also got states underlying that which have different programs, California being, one of those states. So not only is it international when you're all over the world, in the US, you've got Coast Guard, EPA through the vessel general permit, and the states, which all differ. It's a massive challenge. And ship owners just really need to be on top of what's happening in the US. And that's through consulting with counsel, it's through consulting with consultants, it's through consulting with a host of different, entities that are involved in this. But it's a very big challenge. And in 2018-ish, when the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act was implemented, its goal was to take all those regimes in the US and make them consistent so that we had some certainty. We're already several years past the implementation schedule for the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. EPA's regulations setting the standards are due at the end of next year, which is probably about 4 years late. And then the Coast Guard has 2 more years to develop standard regulations to implement those standards. So we're going to have another regime through VITA that the industry is going to have to learn all over. I think it's going to be substantially different, I fear, from what we've got now, but we won't know that for a couple more years. So it's a massive challenge for the international fleet.
Yeah. If I can, Carlene, I'd like to add to Jeannie's comments on that. I fully agree with Jeannie that it's very important for owners to be diligent and be aware of what's going on, and working with consultants, industry associations, their P&I clubs, whatever mechanism they find help for understanding and making sure they comply with the schemes. I do hope as well that we can achieve some of the original intent with the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, in that it'll be less complex for vessels that will stop at multiple states during their journeys in the United States. So I am hoping that we do see some of that impacts. And I know that it impacts, the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act does impact the states, particularly those that have worked very hard to set up their own protection programs while they were waiting for, more protection to come from the federal level. So it will be interesting to see, how that gets implemented. But I do hope that by putting things under the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, that we do see a little bit of streamlining in the United States. That's my hope for the regulations there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. Yes, fingers crossed.
To what Jeannie and Marcy have said from a ballast water equipment manufacturer's perspective, I think it's always interesting, and I think the wording of your question actually was quite important. How does proper ballast water management affect? And I think that is it's an operator in any and every sense of that. And I think if we go back to Marcy's comments that some years ago, 2004, 2007, during those early days, then the decision-making process for owners and operators was somewhat, in fact, very different to today. And I think if we start to look at now the decision-making process that applies to ballast water, even in the last 6 to 10 or 12 months, it's a very different vision. It's a very different vista for everybody that's making those decisions. And I think due to this diversity of regulations that we see internationally, many people have picked a trade route, picked a system and said, hey, here's what applies. And then if the trade route changes, it no longer applies. So that brings in further complexity from a vessel operator point of view. And from a manufacturer, it also brings some challenges from a specification perspective as well. So we're starting to peel back now, I think, what is a fairly big onion. And certainly in the last 6 or 8 months, and this was apparent earlier in the year when we did some travels around Sea Asia, we were starting to see what we at Ecochlor have affectionately termed the ROR. And what we mean by that is the retrofit of retrofits. We're seeing now, because of changes in regulation, diversity, we're seeing people who made commitments to go a certain direction, who have now taken a big time out and saying, this isn't working for us for any number of reasons. And the regulatory aspect of that is very definitely apparent. So people have pulled the plug on programs, have stopped and said, hey, we really need to group round and gather round again now. And of course, because of all the other aspects that are coming in from an environmental aspect of operating a vessel, decarbonisation being the prime topic, we're now seeing very different decisions on ballast water being made because of that. So it's a very interesting matrix as we migrate through those regulations into the decarbonisation arena as well.
Thank you very much, David. I want to ask Matt, because of the profile, you were project director at OSG. I imagine that had something to do with ballast water, and then you went to an equipment manufacturer. How were the decision-making processes and implementations different from your time then versus, as David just alluded to, the decision-making process now, especially with that overlay of sustainability?
I'd say pretty much aligns with what David was saying. We're seeing now a lot of ship owners either retrofitting from where they've had an AMS still, and they're eventually now reaching the end of that. So either retrofitting within the same system. And my previous role at Netsco, we also had some owners who'd made an initial choice, and just due to the operational challenges that they've had with those systems on some of their routes, they've then switched to different types. So that you're seeing these retrofits where certain decisions were made early in terms of a compliance standpoint, and just sort of to get through the door and quick. And now some of the challenges that have arisen are forcing the changes to different types of systems based on trade route. And I think you'll still see that in some ways in terms where we have this mixture of regulations, where vessel operators who are operating outside of the US are still probably going to lean towards things that aren't necessarily US compliant unless they have to. And that'll just vary operator to operator.
Okay, so the assessment process is the same, it's different, it's moving forward. And can you also articulate AMS?
Yes, it was the alternative management system. So these are systems that didn't fully meet the requirements of the BWMS in terms of what was laid out by, say, for example, U.S. Coast Guard. A lot of manufacturers have come up with a retrofit, essentially, that will enable them to become compliant with the D2 guidelines. And what we're seeing now, particularly with a lot of Asian operators that weren't necessarily operating over into the US, they're doing these upgrades now. In some cases, still looking at getting extensions.
Came to 11 minutes past.
In terms of those upgrades, I mean, what technological advancements have you seen are showing positive results in reducing these environmental impacts?
I don't know if it's necessarily a technological.
We're losing you, Matt.
Apologies.
Thank you.
Not so much, I would say, a technological advancement is more of, say, fine tuning of the systems in terms of figuring out what changes have needed to be made over the last decade or so in terms of bettering the performance of the systems, whether that be, say, adding cleaning in place in terms of for some systems so that say UV lamps are clear, so that they're not affected by burnt on or stuck on grime and sediment. And just more general improvements in terms of the technology and lessons we've learned, what changes have needed to be placed.
Okay, thank you. Marcy, what have you seen amongst your members? What sort of advancements or improvements are they looking towards?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. There's a variety of changes that members are making, and some are aware of it. Industry has seen some manufacturers that previously had filters go to a no filter system. And again, these are things that help owners meet, the various needs that David was mentioning. Maybe when they first purchased their system, they didn't transit to locations where filters were problematic, but maybe now the vessel has changed its route and something like that is important. I think we're also seeing other changes that can be made to help with ship owners' energy efficiency. And I think one of the bigger challenges that our members face is the time and the money that it can take to modify a ballast water management system that has existing approvals. So there has to be a very big onus for a maker to proceed with that change, because not only do they have to go through potential changes to their IMO type approval, but their Coast Guard type approval, and then every class and every flag that they have an approval with. So it can literally be millions of dollars and years to make a change to a ballast water management system type approval. So as we look at the need and the desire for innovation, even something like changing the software to allow the system to operate more efficiently requires a modification of every single type approval that a system has. So it's very important that we also recognize that innovation is also going to need the support of the regulatory community to make changes that allow innovation to treatment systems more feasible and practical, and also brings technology to the market quicker. Things like improved UV lamps, things like this. It takes a significant amount of time. So the support from the regulatory community is going to be needed to allow innovations to really be available to ship owners in a timely manner.
Thank you. Jeanne, in terms of the regulatory, or let's call it the enforcement system, what changes have you seen in the continuum of compliance, if you will? We spoke earlier that, yes, the regs came out, we didn't have the technology to meet it. We just heard that the technology continues to improve and there's a continual investment in improvement. But have you seen a corresponding level of successful compliance or a successful program with that, or do we continue to see challenges?
Well, I think challenges are inevitable. The technology is a challenge. On the enforcement side, I think for the first 10 years of the VGP, there was only a handful of enforcement actions. And in the past few years, enforcement has really increased with what seems to be an emphasis on inspecting for VGP compliance. In years past, the EPA and the Coast Guard had an MOU where the Coast Guard would do the inspections and EPA would look at the results and do enforcement. Now I think we're seeing EPA being much more active on its own. In 2023 alone, if you just check press releases, there's been 3 significant VGP enforcement actions into the hundreds of thousands of dollars ranges over a host of different shipping companies. The enforcement effort definitely gets attention, and we've as a compliance lawyer, we work with a lot of companies, obviously, to defend enforcement actions, but to avoid them. And I think critical to avoiding them is making sure good programs in place, making sure your crews are trained, making sure the vessels are audited, and the company should be doing that internally. They shouldn't wait for the regulator to do that. So we're seeing a lot of changes in that regard over the years, of a lot more attention being paid to compliance, not just VGP, but across the board with
There's
vessels
better
coming to the
people coming
US.
in
And
on the
I think
health
that's
safety.
a critical focus of any shipping company.
Yeah.
Training, auditing, verification, and the like. And I think that kind of responded to a question I think I saw in the chat as well.
Okay. Excellent. Well, David, you're a manufacturer and you're continuously looking at your product to meet the market's needs. But are there economic incentives for these companies to invest in technologies and practices that align with, let's say, sustainability goals? What are the drivers and what are the costs?
It's a very difficult one. I think Marcy again alluded to some of this just a moment ago. And when we look at the physical cost of meeting regulatory change, just the process and Ecochlor, there's no surprise that we went through that pain barrier when we brought out the filterless system through 2021. And that was driven by market demands. And we talk about improvements in technology there. The improvement was that the technology was simpler. It eliminated the need to use filtration as a process within the context of the same technology in the same operation. But what it did, I think, was brought some other things to the table. First of all, it brought a greater degree of simplicity, which links back into what Jeanne just mentioned about system operation. The easier it is to operate, the more reliable it can be to operate, and generally the better the results that come out. So that starts to lead a path towards compliance. Now, of course, for people that made decisions early in ballast water, it's a very expensive and very complicated process to change from system A to system B. And one of the things that we found within the regulations is that just because a system has a type approval certificate doesn't mean that it's actually going to do the job and discharge the ballast water that you need. It's very dependent upon trade route, water conditions, and all of the variable parameters that we know impact ballast water and its treatment around the world. So I think with the start point for ballast water, that it didn't give the owner or the operator any significant return on revenue. It didn't give them money back. It didn't make the vessel faster, make them carry more cargo or anything of that nature. It's a very, very big ladder to climb to suddenly now to start to make technological changes that actually are just simply cost. I think once they start to align potentially with other technologies and other parts of the, as we mentioned before, the decarbonisation process as an example, that gives a path forward. So maybe some kind of alignment within a pool of technologies makes that more affordable from an operational point of view. But it is a difficult set of decisions, and we're seeing around the world now companies who'd have one or two people that would make an assessment at superintendent level. Now there is a huge pool of people putting in system information saying, what is the best group of technologies for me now and in the future? It's a very different approach.
Mm-hmm. And as they move forward in that decision-making process, I mean, Matt, you're working with companies on their sustainability profiles. How does this area of ballast water management fit into the decision-making that is coming forward on that?
Currently, I think a lot of the focus is aimed more at the decarbonization space in terms of energy efficiency. And ballast water, like David said, is looked at it's a cost. You're not necessarily gaining any commercial benefit as an owner. It's a value add and a regulatory compliance. So right now, or in the next few sessions of the MEPC, they're looking at the midterm measures in terms of decarbonization and putting in market-based measures and economic incentives in terms of decarbonizing and switching to alternative fuels and like that, and that sort of thing. Something like that would probably be beneficial in terms of ballast water, or if that could tie in, especially as when we look at decarbonization and energy efficiency, sort of every percentage is counting. And some of these systems, especially where they've been retrofitted onto older vessels, have increased the power demands of the auxiliaries while in port during ballasting operations. So owners will be looking at doing cost benefit analysis there in terms of what can I gain by either reducing the energy from switching to a different system or improving operations, or switching modes potentially in terms of operations with the current systems on board.
Great. Well, this is a very complex topic, and we talked about the different regimes. And Marcy alluded a little bit earlier to biofouling, which is now a topic that is coming up. What have we learned? I mean, Marcy, you said it's not going to be as complex or as difficult, but is that right? I mean, what have we learned from this ballast water regulatory process that we can apply or avoid?
That's a really good question, Carlene. And I think that there will definitely be aspects of biofouling and the regulations that are coming that will be complex. You know, what is the frequency? What type of technologies are going to be acceptable? Do we need in-water capture? You know, so there are definitely a lot of scientific and technical questions that will prove difficult and that maybe don't apply to ballast water. But what I'm hoping is that we can utilize things that have been developed through the ballast water regulatory programs to facilitate. For instance, do we need to recreate the wheel on, you know, guidelines, and what can we take from ballast water that are applicable? You know, biofouling management plans. Can we adopt some of the general templates that are available for, you know, ballast water and make them functional for biofouling? So those are the things where I'm hoping that we can not recreate the wheel, but just adapt the wheels that already exist. And maybe that will facilitate things, not only for well, for all sectors, you know, the scientific sectors, the industry sectors, the regulatory sectors. And again, there will be, in my view, aspects of biofouling that are unique just to biofouling, and we won't be able to attach what we learned in ballast water. But again, I hope we can gain some efficiencies and be able to move forward a little bit more expeditiously.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to one of our questions, and Jeanne did begin to address it earlier. How important do you think it is for vessel crews to be properly trained and maintaining that training to ensure that ballast water management systems are being operated as designed and tested? David, how much commitment do you have to a training regime and training protocols to ensure that your technology is being properly applied?
Yeah, great question, and it's become, no surprisingly, of growing importance certainly over the last couple of years. I think as people's minds have turned to growing regulatory compliance, the need for crews to know what the ballast water management plan means and how the system is supposed to operate has grown exponentially. What we've done as a manufacturer is put in place a number of systems and services. Of course, the problems of COVID and limited travel didn't help us, so we moved from what had traditionally been only in-person learning at point of commissioning, and that was really a great emphasis for us to commission a system, train the crew with our technicians on board. That was a little too limiting, because if we had crew changes, anything of that nature, it meant we hadn't really immersed ourselves or imprinted the system within the company as much as we needed to. So we've diversified by desire and by design to basically encompass the training aspects, to do online, to do classroom sessions, and we've moved away from only using the commissioning engineers. Every single installation that we start upon, months before the process, there will be a conversation about the need to train and the need to remain in contact with the vessel. Fortunately, the way that our process worked, and it is a little different to some of the other manufacturers, but nevertheless, it's still a training need. We appoint a vessel delegate, and that allows us to remain in contact with the vessel on a regular basis. And as well as looking at the technical function of the system, it also allows us to conduct ongoing training, so new crew members, changes to the system, upgrades to software. You know, it's not a static environment, and so I think we have to continue that level of involvement with them as it goes. Just because we're good to go today doesn't mean that that'll be so in 6 months or a year's time if the software changes. So it's a vital ingredient of the whole mix. And ultimately, you can have the best system in the world. If it isn't operated because the crew can't use it, it's not going to be compliant.
Okay, now David, you're looking at a lot of different, Matt, you're looking at a lot of different systems and a lot of different companies. If you were to guide companies in terms of training, where would you spend the most amount of time? Did you hear that, Matt?
No, sorry. Could you repeat that? Sorry, my
Oh,
headphones died.
certainly. No, that's okay. I just wanted to know, you're looking at a lot of different, David just described the extensive training and relationship building that they do with Ecochlor. You're seeing a lot of different companies come across your bow. Where could companies, what are companies doing right and what could they do better in terms of training personnel?
I think tying into what David said, more frequent training is really the really more the to me the more critical point, and that and something even stepping up from maybe once a year to twice a year, so that things are fresher in their mind. I mean, especially with as the systems are updating, or like David mentioned, having software updates come out in terms of
Right.
changes or potentially different mode changes as type approvals change. Just having
Yeah,
more frequent uh, sessions, training, frequently bringing as new crew members come on, um, to get them up to speed as quickly and as often as possible.
okay, I guess the challenge I can envision for that is, number one, how many systems are on a vessel? And how much time, how much can you expand the 24 hours in a day?
Very true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that as well, Carlene. I think it's super important for the manufacturer to provide a thorough and quality training program and touching base with the vessel, actively engaging. I think that is super critical, and a computer-based training or some mechanism for when crew changeouts happen is really, really important. And from my view, looking at crew members, as you just mentioned, there's only so many hours in a day, and the crew have a significant amount of responsibility, particularly when they're in port doing cargo operations. So I think manufacturers need to be able to provide, I just refer to as like a quick reference guide. If there's trouble with the system, they don't have time to go read a 2,000-page manual. They need something that's going to tell them quickly, oh, if you're getting this alarm, look at X, Y, and Z. And I think that's really important to help the crew not encounter points of frustration, right? They're busy. All of a sudden, the system's alarming. They're not being able to operate the system. What do they do? And something that they can hopefully look at within just a few minutes to diagnose, oh, let me try these things. And I think that's really important. And Jeanne touched on it earlier, that I think the proactivity of the ship owner is really important too. And I'm seeing a tremendous amount of increased awareness on ship owners, which is on their part, which is great to see. Not only are they really becoming more aware of, the questions they need to ask, but it's really important that they understand the complexity of the system and that their crew has what they need. And if the crew doesn't have what they need, then go back to the manufacturer and make sure that the manufacturer provides what the crew needs. So that engagement from the owner to proactively make sure that their crews have the resources available, I think is really important as well.
And Carlene, if I could just add to that, I think coming back to the training, it needs to be a spectrum of training. CBT is great. Training from the maker is great. In-person training is great. The superintendent visits on board are great. The quick reference guide. It's got to be a combination of everything, so the requirements get ingrained. They don't just become a one-off here and there when a ship is coming to the US or not. It's a lot of work. And there needs to be, in my estimation, a very good shoreside point of contact. So with the ship going in a bunch of different jurisdictions, different US states, they need a quick reference person that they can go to and say, hey, here's where we're going. Is there anything new and different here? So it's got to be that whole continuum spectrum to, I think, really make it successful. And I just want to stress, this isn't just ballast water. This is training across the board for ship operations. And it's a lot of work and it poses challenges, but it's critically important to staying in compliance.
Well, speaking of that, Jeannie, what percentage, and I'm not asking you to name names, but what percentage of compliance failures do you think are attributable to training inefficiencies or training, lack of training? And how many are due to equipment failures? And is that equipment failure due to lack of training?
Hard question. Equipment failures are not a big part of what we see in enforcement actions. I think the regulators generally understand if equipment is properly maintained and there's a failure, if you're dealing with it properly, I don't see that as being a big risk as long as you deal with it properly. You have something that doesn't work, you can report it, you tell class, you tell flag, you have a process set up to fix it in a timeline. And 99 times out of 100, a regulator will look at that and say, okay, that's what a company should be doing. It's the misses that are the problem. Were there training gaps? Were there requirements that were missed? Does the captain not know about a particular program? Can the company not show documentation? That's where we're really seeing the enforcement actions coming into play.
Okay.
So they're the big risks.
Thank you. I'm going to grab another question. How does the IMO D2 standards for ships to have ballast water management systems in place by September of next year potentially affect the upcoming VITA? Also, is the cleaning hull of vessels regulated in any way, or are there best management practices in place to ensure that invasive species are not being transferred?
I'll take that on very quickly, and there might be folks on the phone that can answer, or on the call, on the webinar that can answer in more detail than me. VITA and the D2 have nothing to do with each other. VITA is a new law being implemented in the United States. D2 is under the Ballast Water Convention, which the US is not party to. The current regime adopts the IMO standards for ballast water discharges, though the equipment is different. EPA is coming out with new standards under VITA, which are due to come out this fall in draft form. We don't know what they're going to look like. They can hopefully look like IMO and have the same standards, or they may look very different. We don't know the answer to that. In terms of hull cleaning, the BGP does have provisions related to cleaning of hulls in port. So that is in place in that regard.
Hey, I'm sure, Marcy, you would like to add to that?
Yeah, really just echoing Jeannie's. It's really important, and I see this confusion commonly, but it's really important to stress that the IMO's Ballast Water Management Convention is completely and entirely separate from the Coast Guard and the EPA's requirements. That is number one. And unfortunately, if a vessel is operating, both in US waters and other international waters, then they have to be aware of and comply with both separate regimes. So that's really, really important. And then also just to point out that at NAPC 80 on biofouling, there was approval of, the biofouling guidelines. So, that's important. There is more work to be done on that from what I understand, but there are some best management practices and guidelines for biofouling as well.
What is the timeline on those?
I'm not 100% sure. I think the goal is to have them in the next couple of NEPCs being adopted. So, we can get the text approved and then we have an adoption schedule. So I think there's some more work to do, but it's important to recognize that those are out there, and Matthew may have some additional information on that as well.
Yes, there is some more work to be done, as Marcy was saying. I think specifically looking at in-port hull cleaning, they're targeting 2025 currently for that. That was latest out of this last MEPC.
Excellent, thank you. I mean, we've spent decades looking at critters on the inside of the boats, and now we're looking at the critters on the outside of the boats. David, have system manufacturers been willing or able to provide support to operators on VGP and implementation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think as a manufacturer, you start to initially look at things a little bit introvertly and then realize all of a sudden that there is more that you need to do. And I think pretty much everybody that's been involved in this at any stage has been through that process. What we have found is that depending on skill sets and the actual need and the location, we've been able to facilitate that either directly or we've been able to facilitate that with partner companies, so friends in the industry, consultants and other entities that are able to support that. I think it's massively important that we do that. I mean, that's part of the education process, part of the training. I think also part of the support diversity that Jeanne mentioned earlier. There's no one magic cure for any of this. It's a combination of things to suit a chameleon-like set of circumstances. So I think we equally have to respond to that in industry, and I think we've positioned ourselves as Ecochlor in a very good way to do that.
Marcy, how is BEMA supporting the industry in this area?
I think as far as, putting out publications and particularly commissioning testing was a really big confusing point for a lot of people when it first came out. We still do see some confusion on that. So BEMA has made some publications on the IMO's commissioning testing requirement. And then, of course, any inquiries that members have are certainly BEMA is the technical resource for those sorts of things. So I do think that as we watch the regulations and we participate as BEMA in the regulatory development, that is also, a goal to help facilitate not only, we can have great regulations, but if they can't be implemented practically by industry, or they're not based on science and technical information, then we have a problem. So BEMA is working to, on all regulatory regards, to provide the technical input about the practical implementation of ballast water treatment on board, and then also expanding into the biofouling sector, covering other emerging environmental technologies. And I think it's important to note, just so people are aware, not only do we have changes coming up in, the U.S. Regime with the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act that we've discussed several times on this call, but it's important to recognize that, the convention is almost, 20 years old, and there is now in progress a convention review process that is happening at the IMO. So what kind of amendments we might see to the IMO's Ballast Water Management Convention, we need to pay attention to that process as well.
Excellent, thank you. For most ships, IMO compliance through the end of the experience building phase at all costs protect the vessel's non-penalization provisions, referring to MEPC 290(71). Jeanne, I hope you're paying attention. Take the remaining had time to learn how to properly operate the ballast water management system before penalties for IMO apply. For U.S. Coast Guard EPA compliance, develop a robust contingency plan. For example, a tanker operating at a U.S. port with a captain of the port order not discharge can lose several hundred thousands through off-hire pilots, tugs, line handlers, etc. If your contingency plan is a fraction of that potential cost, embrace it. That looks like more of an answer from Bill Burrows. Jeanne, any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I think in the last point, well, first of all, IMO had an experience building phase where they were encouraging port states not to penalize when they were just getting the systems up and going, which I think is a great approach. The U.S. never adopted that, but I think in practicality, maybe we've seen some of it. What Bill is referring to is systems that aren't working, say in the Mississippi River. So you get into the Mississippi River, it's muddy, and your treatment system isn't working. What is your contingency plan for dealing with that? Discharging untreated ballast water is not going to be approved. It's just not. And more times than I can imagine, the Coast Guard has sent vessels outside 200 nautical miles to exchange out there and come back, which is an incredibly expensive proposition. So owners need to think about, if they're going into the Mississippi River, what is my contingency plan? Am I cleaning my tanks before I get in? Am I exchanging ballast water already? Am I able to go out beyond 12 miles and safely discharge and then treat and come back in? And that really needs to be thought about, because it's going to be an expensive proposition regardless, but having thought about it can definitely minimize the cost associated with the system that's not working properly, maybe in environments that weren't anticipated. And, you know, David, Marcy, I'd love your take on that. I'm just kind of commenting. I see the bad things that happen. I don't see the things that always work.
Yeah, I think Jeannie as well. I mean, what it does, it you know, we're almost at the end point with that, but what it has done, I think, for a number of operators, we highlighted this earlier, it points them right back to the beginning again and said, well, why did I make the decisions that I did and I made, and why is it not working for me now? Fundamentally, is there something that I'm missing in the middle here? You know, is it the type of system? Is it the water condition? Is it the technology? And what can I do? And we mentioned before when we talked about reinvestment costs to upgrade or change or add a different function to the system. I think ultimately, as Bill has highlighted there, to have this contingency plan and to know exactly what you do before it occurs is absolutely critical, particularly in those operational conditions that we highlighted. You know, it's whatever we think about from compliance testing, as soon as you start to go into those inland waterway areas, as soon as you go up to the Mississippi River, if we're going to Exxon at Baton Rouge and we're going to be ballasting there, that is a very different environment to a test tank scenario. And so I think to have that contingency there is an absolute must for any and every vessel that's going to apply those trades, or indeed might change to that particular trade pattern. It's an important part of vessel management for certain.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Marcy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think just adding to that, it kind of, well, there's a lot of thoughts I have on that discussion, but I think it's really important to understand that the ballast water management plan, kind of historically or kind of in practice, it's kind of been this template document that we change the name on. You know, we don't really change any details. But what we're finding as we go forward with implementation, and we're really learning what happens, as David has just pointed out, that each vessel is different. So the contingencies, and probably what Jeannie sees in her work, is what works for one vessel isn't going to apply to an entire fleet. So the role of the ballast water management plan, from what I'm seeing, has to be much more prominent to build in what is the safe contingency plan for each vessel. What does that vessel do, considering its treatment system that it has installed on board, considering any requirements from its class or flag, vessel safety, all of these sorts of things. And I wanted to just comment on, as we get into, you know, enforcement and all that, the experience building phase has been very interesting, and Bill Burrows raises an interesting point. What we saw through the reports issued by the Secretariat at MEPC 78 about the experience building phase is that there wasn't really a lot of enforcement. But we have to recognize as that experience building phase ends, we're going to see more. For instance, I'll just give you one simple example. The D2 standard applied at the time of that report, applied to about 14,000 vessels. And of those vessels, of that, only 7,300 approximately had systems installed that were required to. That's 51.8% compliance. Now, that's because we have a non-penalization period. But when that ends, are we going to see 51.8% non-compliance? I hope not.
Well, thank you for that. That's an incredible statistic. You know, we've spent most of this call talking about the ship, the crew, and the manufacturers, but we haven't talked about the port. And there's Miranda's asking a very good question, which is, how do ports play a role in ballast water management and or biofouling? And is there a role for them to play? We know with MARPOL 1, ports are required to have, reception facilities and also for 5. But what about for ballast water and antifouling? Is there a requirement or a role that ports can play?
I'm happy to hit that quickly first, Carlene. And one of the Coast Guard compliance methods is discharging ashore. At least I'm not aware of any facilities that exist right now for discharging ballast water ashore. I know there have been efforts at permitting ballast treatment system barges. For example, you have a barge that can take the ballast water from a vessel and treat it to state standards, because the VGP wouldn't apply to this. It would be a different state permit. So I hear those efforts are ongoing. I don't know if they're successful. You're looking at a massive amount of water that would need to be discharged and treated. And I think ports could play a role in facilitating some reasonable, practical shoreside, barge side treatment of ballast water if vessels were unable, for whatever reason, to use their systems.
Yeah,
So
I think
you
just to
would say
support
it's
that, Jeanne, just to support that, I think we've seen a number of instances where not the port necessarily themselves, but with a third-party contractor are able to offer that facility. And like you say, the regulations between different ports and different states is particularly important within that context. It's fairly limited, I think, in the ability to apply that and action that, and certainly not available as a wholesale option. But certainly there've been a number of technical explorations, trial facilities, and cooperatives set up to deal with that, and certainly we've seen some of that activity around the Gulf Coast in recent years for definite.
Have you seen anything, David, that actually worked or was implemented, or are they all kind of experimental pilot projects, or sort of thought going into it?
It's certainly thought gone into it, and I think a number of opportunities where ballast can be discharged either to portside tanks or to secondary barges. I think they've been using a combination of technologies, so bringing in different things such as UV treatment, pasteurization. It's certainly not a wholesale thing. I think there are absolutely definite advantages to being able to do that. But as I say, from a wholesale point of view, it seems to be termed right now more as a reactionary support mechanism as opposed to a mainstream application. We're coming to port and here's what we're going to do. In addition, it's allied to the port, but not part of the port facility itself, I think, which is also a different part to play.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, and so I'd like to do a bit of a lightning round. What do you feel will be the biggest challenge as we move forward in ballast water management? Who wants to go first?
I'll go. I'm
Okay,
gonna throw out VITA as the biggest challenge, and it has the potential of turning the regimes as we know them now on their head. So the VGP is the floor. VITA can only be more stringent. VITA is going to apply out to 12 miles, not 3 like it does now. I think that's going to pose challenges. We'll know a lot more when EPA proposes its proposed regulations this fall. And my parting words would be just encouraging the industry to pay attention, look at the proposals, and get engaged. I think the success of any program is going to be hinging on communications and engagement between industry and the regulators.
Thank you, Jeanne. David.
Yeah, I think mirroring that, I mean, I think to ensure that we recognize that ballast water has not reached an endpoint and that it's very much a live and ongoing entity, and that all of the things that we've discussed today and all of the things that the regulations point to are ongoing and will develop, and we'll have to continue to meet those challenges.
Thank you. Matt.
I think VITA definitely presents sort of the biggest immediate hurdle in terms of what we'll be facing next. And as David said, it's not going to be over next year, the year after. This is something we're going to be circling back on in the years to come for sure.
Thank you. Okay, Marcy, you're our sweeper.
Thank you so much. Similar to the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, I think the potential amendments that we will see to the Ballast Water Management Convention could also serve to change things up a little bit. And as Jeanne has stressed, paying attention is going to be key. And as we have continued awareness and experience with system operation, inspections, enforcement, again, we have to go back to everyone needs to pay attention. It's not just the owners, it's the system manufacturers, it's the scientists, it's the regulatory community. All of us are in this together. So we cannot point fingers at one sector or the other as the responsible party. We all have to engage and pay attention and recognize this isn't going away and we can't kick it down the road. This is here and this is for all of us to implement.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists today, Jeanne, David, Matt, and Marcy, for sharing their expertise with us and their wisdom. As we have noted throughout this entire hour, it is a complex and seemingly ever-changing challenge to our industry to operate it at its best. So let's keep it all going and keep the dialogue going. And NAMEPA is very happy to provide this opportunity through this webinar series. As I said, we'll have one in September, November, and December, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye all. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.